In the markets of ancient Thebes, a fisherman laid his catch out under the sun, knowing that within a single day, without action, it would rot beyond use. Food spoilage was not a distant threat in Egypt. It was a daily, unavoidable reality, and every household had to solve it or go hungry. Egypt sit along one of the hottest, driest stretches of land in the ancient world. Rain was rare, sometimes absent for years at a time in parts of the country. Temperatures during much of the year climbed high enough to spoil meat and fish within hours if left untreated. For most crops and proteins, freshness was measured not in days, but in a race against the sun. Yet that same harsh climate, so destructive to unprotected food, became one of the Egyptians' greatest tools. Dry air draws moisture out of organic matter, and moisture is what bacteria and mold need to thrive. Without refrigeration, without ice, and without any mechanical way to cool their food, Egyptians turned to a method that worked in harmony with their environment. They let the desert do the work for them. Drying was likely the oldest and most widespread preservation method in Egypt. Fish pulled from the Nile were split open, cleaned, and laid flat on wooden racks or woven mats under direct sunlight. Within a day or two, much of the moisture had evaporated, leaving behind a lighter, hardened product that could last for weeks rather than hours. Meat, when available, underwent a similar process, sometimes cut into thin strips to speed drying and reduced spoilage risk. Fruits followed the same logic. Dates, figs, and grapes were spread out to dry, concentrating their natural sugars and transforming them into a preserved food that could be stored well past their harvest season. Salt worked alongside drying, and in many cases the two methods were combined. Salt draws water out of tissue through a natural chemical process, and in doing so, it creates an environment hostile to the organisms that cause decay. Fish and meat were often packed in salt or rubbed with it before being left to dry. This combination extended shelf life considerably, and salted fish in particular became a staple that could be transported along the Nile to feed workers, soldiers, and laborers far from where the fish were caught. Salt was not unlimited, and access to it likely varied by region and by household wealth, but where it was available, it played an important supporting role. Grain presented a different kind of challenge. Wheat and barley, the backbone of the Egyptian diet, were harvested in enormous quantities and needed to last an entire year, sometimes longer if a poor harvest was expected. The greatest threats to stored grain were not heat alone, but moisture, insects, and rodents. To guard against these, Egyptians built granaries, often raised structures with thick mud brick walls and narrow openings near the top. This design limited exposure to humidity and made it harder for pests to reach the grain inside. Some granaries were shaped like tall domes or silos, filled from openings above and emptied from doors near the base. Administrators tracked what went in and what came out, since grain was not only food, but a form of currency and taxation, making its protection a matter of both survival and economic stability. Clay played its own essential role across nearly every kind of food storage. Pottery vessels, sealed with clay stoppers, wax, or resin, protected their contents from insects, dust, and fluctuating air. Oils, beer, wine, and preserved fish were commonly stored this way. The porous nature of unglazed clay also allowed for a subtle cooling effect. As water seeped slowly through the vessel walls and evaporated on the outside, it drew heat away from the contents inside, keeping liquids and perishables slightly cooler than the surrounding air. It was a simple, almost accidental form of refrigeration, built entirely from the materials at hand. Where food needed more than sealed pottery, Egyptians turned to architecture itself. Storage rooms were frequently built partially underground or shaded deep within thick-walled structures, where sunlight rarely reached and temperatures remained noticeably lower than outside. Airflow mattered too. Narrow vents and elevated openings allowed warm air to escape while limiting the amount of stagnant moisture-trapping air that could accelerate decay. Fermentation added another layer to this system, particularly for grain-based products. Bread dough and beer both relied on natural fermentation processes, which not only altered flavor, but also extended how long these staples could be safely consumed. Some vegetables may have been preserved through similar processes, though the evidence here is less complete than for bread and beer, which were central to daily Egyptian life. No single method explains how Egyptians kept their food usable for weeks or months at a time. Fish demanded drying and salt. Grain demanded sealed, elevated, well-ventilated storage. Oils and liquids depended on clay vessels shaped to control temperature and airflow. Bread and beer relied on fermentation. Each food had its own vulnerabilities, and each solution answered a specific problem. What emerges is not the story of one clever invention, but the story of an entire system, built gradually over generations, shaped by trial, necessity, and the demands of a challenging environment. Long before mechanical cooling ever existed, the people of the Nile had already learned how to work with their climate rather than against it. And in doing so, they built a foundation of food preservation that would sustain one of the ancient world's great civilizations for thousands of years.